All right, one of the signature tunes, you would say, of the songs that characterized the reign, or shall we say the rule, of President Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, the second president and the longest serving one. This was a period when you would say the country was awash with the Moi spirit, that everywhere you went there was now this, Moi that, everything, and the songs were everywhere on the radio, and every time there was a public function and all of that. I think that if there was a period that composers went on overdrive, it must have been that period. Mwalimu Wasonga there with Tawala Kenya. What sort of period was this? Because some people say Moi changed dramatically from 1982 and went on overdrive to consolidate power around himself, with suspicion around opponents and that sort of thing, and not the Moi that took over in 1978 and the Moi that emerged from the attempted coup in 1982 was totally like day and night.
Joe, I don't drink, but I think political power works like alcohol.
Yeah.
Because the effects are gradual.
Last week was opium, today is alcohol.
Yeah.
We are taking notes. Proceed.
I'll learn on something I can take at some point. And it's gradual. Because if you watch the political journey of Moi, these songs were not happening between 1978 and 83. They came after. Now, 82 changed Moi because 82 made real the threats that he was facing, both at a personal and a political level. And he moved on to respond, and responded very robustly and brutally. That is when we started hearing of detentions. That is when we started seeing the assault on the university lecturers. The likes of Mukaru Nganga were exiled, the likes of Ngugi wa Thiong'o also had to go in exile. Because the environment suddenly became very intolerant. Now, what followed intolerance is the songs that you're talking about, because now the KANU regime, the Moi system, moved to the next level. After consolidating political power, they moved this to the next level, which is cultivating a personality cult, where now Moi becomes this bigger than life figure. And if you look at the trends in the 80s, this was happening across the continent. This is exactly what Kamuzu Banda was doing in Malawi at the time. This is exactly what Moi's friends like Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now DRC, was doing. This is what Habyarimana was doing in Burundi. You go further to West Africa, Paul Biya was doing these same things. Omar Bongo in Gabon was doing these things. So it became an African culture, and that's how Moi joined the list of African strongmen. And you can see our Western media colleagues, they really like describing that as a strongman, autocratic, and all that, because the era of fear, crushing opponents, and taking control of political rule was followed immediately by that of cultivating a personality
elevated
cult.
these people to mythical figures, almost demigods in their own right. In fact, what intrigues me the most every time I study this part of our history, and especially the songs that are being composed, those songs were not empty tunes. I mean, they were loaded with political messaging. If you think about it, they were things that were framing and profiling the people who are challenging whatever the government was doing at the time as traitors. There are certain words and certain phrases that gained currency at that time. There was, yes, Wasaliti, there was Wazalendo, and then there's
actually an illustration. You can just watch that quickly. Machakos choir, some school kids singing about kwekwe.
Shambani mwanyayo na ziliwe wana kwekwe shambani mwanyayo nazilimwe.
You know, Joe, for the very uncanny resemblance with Francis Bashir,
the soloist.
It's not old enough, though.
Yeah, not old enough.
Not as old as that clip, though.
Exactly. But listen to those words.
Kwekwe,
zilimwe, and waangamizwe. That was the public approval of the repression that was there in those years. Because it could be done through song, it could be done through speeches, and government agents followed that to the letter.
And there were words like, I remember, before you jump in, Jamila, there were words like puppets of their foreign masters,
yes.
People who are hell-bent on causing fear and despondency among peace-loving Kenyans.
Wow.
There was also another one where they profile these people as I said, traitors, that somehow there was this national cause that these people were fighting against, usually in collusion with
foreign powers,
with former colonizers who are now. That's a powerful message to give to a country that
right
has
after
been
independence.
Yes.
Because when you look at messaging, Joe, growing up during that period, I'm the youngest on this table, but what even the information that we were fed, what we saw, what we heard, you talk about the songs, you talk about the messaging behind it, we only had one avenue for all these things. Either it was from the national radio or the television. And the first 15 minutes of the news bulletin was what the president had been up to that whole day for about 15-20 minutes. Ameenda kanisani, amefanya nini. So even our environment, what we could see or what we could hear, was tailored towards now having Moi as who he was. In fact, I think for a very long time, I believed as a child that every president of every other country was called Moi. Because he was that big a deal for us. Yeah, Moi wa Uganda.
Moi wa Uganda.
Yes, so he was that big. He was this person who was the ultimate, the head, the president, like tulikuwa tunamwenzi kabisa. Right. And the songs would not help. And the fact that we sang them every day, we were part of those choirs that would, I remember during the 10th anniversary of Moi's leadership, 1988, there was this huge celebration that was done, and we had all these children coming there, and they sang and they danced, and it was all over. So all these subtle messages were created in such a way that sisi wananchi tuamini kwamba yes, he is the ultimate, ni yeye kiongozi wetu, hakuna mwingine kama yeye. And it sort of shaped us in terms of how we believed as Moi to be this omnipresent person who could do no wrong, or who could show no weakness, who would always stand tall with his fimbo ya nyayo. And that was the image we had of Moi growing up as a little child.
To the point that when he was unwell, I think for a short time, and he hadn't been seen in public, we were all wondering, what had happened. But I'd like to talk briefly about what he did with the law, because this was a very big tactic of his. If he wanted to do something, even going heavy-handed, he would change the law. And then it would be within the law, and anyone who wants to challenge it would start to challenge the legality of it. For example, after the 1982 coup that we're saying, changed him, this is when he introduced Section 2A, making Kenya a de jure one-party state, so that anyone else who was out of or trying to form a party then did that. And it just in how he used the law, between 1964 and 1990, there were 24 constitutional amendments that were enacted by Parliament. All of them were to strengthen the presidency, and this was done at the expense of civil rights. If you take a look at...
That's both across Jomo Kenyatta
Yes, absolutely. In 1986, Parliament enacted Act number 14, then Act number 4, imposing limitations on the independence of the judiciary. Section 61, to give the president the power to appoint the chief justice. Then in 1986 and 88, there were constitutional amendments to provide for the removal of security of tenure of the Attorney General, the Auditor General, and the Controller. Parliament did not resist any of these amendments because by then they were squarely under the president's hand. Even the Act 14 of 1988 to give the prerogative to detain critiques of the regime for 14 days. And at this point, they were being coerced into submissions. And the list goes on and on about how he managed to change the law at the expense of civil rights movements. And this was it. And, you were talking about the attempts at silencing the intelligent, the Willy Mutungas of this world, Katama Mukangis, who were detained, and others, including, Miguna, all of them who were forced to flee into exile. But this was just it. He decided what he wanted to do. He created the law, Parliament passed it, and then he went on and was heavy-handed, so that if you wanted to challenge it, you were challenging something that was legal.
You see, it was interesting how that went through the law.
Yes, right?
You see, without saying too many things, let's put it straight. Moi was a master manipulator. What he wanted, he got, regardless of how he did it. And as Yvonne says, he would use the law, but that was the subtle part of it. If he really wanted something, he would get it, regardless. And that's why anybody who questioned his leadership style could not survive. I mean, that's how and why we have torture chambers at Nyayo House and Nyati House. And there are people in this country, even now, who don't understand why people are saying very rosy things about retired President Daniel Arap Moi. People suffered, greatly so. I mean, people lost lives, people were maimed, people lost livelihoods. There are people whose lives were changed completely. Yeah. And that's why they would not have very good things to say about retired President Daniel Arap Moi. Well, we are told it's an African to say nasty things about the departed, but I think it's also important to say a few things so that people can learn.
Or say the truth.
But it's also a question of, I hear they call it binary contrasts. You know, respect versus fear. Which was which? Was Moi feared or was he respected?
That's important.
Yeah? If he was respected, how? If he was feared, why? Those are the fundamentals that I would look at.
There are people who believe, and Linus was alluding to this, that there was something that was sweeping across Africa within the first few years of independence. Some of it, of course, people loving power and wanting to stay there for a very long time. But there was also this sense that they needed to keep the countries intact, to keep the nation together. That's what they were calling it, nation building and whatever. And some of them were picking from examples like in Southeast Asia, where you had the countries that later became the Asian tigers, and even China, which as we speak now is one of the world powers, and they did not follow the route of the Western path of liberal democracy and that sort of thing. And so these people had this idea that for us to keep the country intact, then you needed to make sure that the people who were making too much noise were taken care of in that way. But then there was a sense in which some of them had this sense of country, which then was lost somewhere down the road. So if you were to look at the flip side of all of these leaders, some of them had this idea, because I mean, even Nyerere, who's regarded as having been a great leader, it's not as if Tanzania was this free place where you could do whatever you wanted, but you could see that some of them had this sense that they needed to make a nation out of these disparate groups that had come from that colonial struggle, and they were in their different corners, but somehow history had put them together in one geographical space called Kenya, Uganda, and whatever it is. So they had a flip side to their methods that kind of suggested that this is how they understood it. And remember, a lot of them came from traditional societies where the king, for example, Mobutu Sese Seko said this a lot, like the chief is the chief. Whatever the chief says, that's what goes. And in many traditional African settings, it was unthinkable to actually question what the chief said. And it was what it was. No one even thought twice about it. So these are guys that suddenly confronted with this reality where they are the chief, and there are all these people who are challenging the authority. So it was also a contextual issue given the historical period in which they actually ruled.
And they had to, considering what the colonialists had done, divided people along the tribal lines, sending them into their reserves. So they had this uphill task of creating a nation out of what had been severely divided by the colonialists. And I guess that was what went into Nyayoism, some of the things that he was saying, peace, love, and unity. But then, of course, that was then taken, you know,
yet when it comes to his personality and style, from conversations that we've had with many of his associates, some of them are very deep loyalists who could obviously paint a very rosy picture. Then there are those moderates who have had access to him and are still able to actually give you a fairly accurate picture of the man. They considered him generous to the hilt. Moi would know about you, would ask about your family, and that is when the culture of political handouts actually also began. So the handouts though a political weapon, was also an expression of the kindness of Moi. And he extended this to a lot of people. Last week we had a panel here, and Njeru Kadhangu and Koigi Wamare came up with very, very interesting positions about the personality of Moi. They also acknowledged that though he was repressive, there was something very kind about the person of Daniel Arap Moi that did not show in the way he did some of the politics. At a personal level, very, very generous to the hilt.
Yeah, it said actually even the people who worked for him, he knew them by name, and he would confront you and say, hey, Francis, shida yako ni nini? And if it was, oh, I need some money or a piece of land or whatever, then he would actually, and he would know, and he would follow up and say, hey, ile shamba yako linunua unafanya nini, that sort of thing. So he was that kind of person that on the one side, there were all these things that were happening on the political scene, but at the personal level, you find very many stories of people who talk of his generosity, and basically he's someone who cared about people who are in his circles.
Being two-faced, I would say, because on one hand, there are people who are saying he was very brutal. But on the other hand, the people who are saying he was very generous. So look at the contrast. And it was, I think, in my opinion, a defense mechanism. While this side will say he's brutal, he would get defense from this side that will say he's generous. So look at, a lot of times, Moi did not defend himself. Even when very serious allegations were made against him, there are people who were very ready to defend him at any cost. And that's why you will see even talk about detention without trial, talk about all those, disappearance and killings. There are people who would say, Moi ako sawa, because they were beneficiaries of his generosity. So it was that two-faced scenario that helped him to survive for quite a while. Unlike a scenario where people would say, no, he's bad completely, or he's good completely. So look at it in that way. But
Joe, if we look at Moi's 24 years rule, even after the coup attempt, then came now the scramble for the agitation for multi-party democracy in Kenya, and of course the repeal of Section 2A. I don't know if we have that soundbite. Robert, if we can listen to Mzee saying Section 2A imeenda. Oh, we don't have it? Okay, fine. We can talk about it. Was a significant moment considering the fact that even after repealing of Section 2A, we still had Moi winning 2 elections in 1992 and 1997. Of course, there are those who say that he actually actively scrambled the opposition, because if you look at results from some of those elections, President Moi had maybe 38% of the total vote. And then the other parties, there was DP, there was Ford Esle, there was Ford Kenya, together, combined, would get the rest. They over 60-something% votes. But because they were not united, Moi would win. He won in 92 and 1997. And then we had, Sabasaba, we had the scramble, we had the IPPG, and ultimately in 2002, Mzee aliondoka, picking, of course, Uhuru Kenyatta as his successor. But then now, I'll go to the end and maybe you can bring me back at some point. Moi leaving in 2002, I think for many was a shock, because I think even after the elections and the euphoria and yote yawezekana bila Moi, there are those who actually thought he would not leave. And the fact that after the results of the 2002 elections, Moi aliondoka kabisa and he went, it was unexpected, because as history has shown us, African leaders rarely leave, despite ruling for 20, 24, 25, 30, 32 years.
But Moi doing that,
Omar still there,
Paul
Biya in Cameroon
is still there.
Yes, and it was unexpected. But I think for many,
has been so sick, the guy can barely take care of him.
But he can't. The father died.
Oh, the one, sorry, I just forgot.
Yes.
But I think that is something that a lot of people remember, that 2002 Moi aliondoka. But remember, opposition united during that time.
Sorry.
Ali Bongo is the son of Omar Bongo, who actually started off as Albert Bongo. He changed his name somewhere.
Linus, as you chip in, I'm looking at something that Jamila has said, and it would be very nice if you could explain it. The split in the opposition was not accidental. It was sponsored. And it was sponsored for survival.
Yes.
And that's why I would say Moi was a master planner.
He was a master planner. And when he won the 1992 election, there was a split parliament where Ford Kenya had 31 members of parliament, and Ford Asili had 31 members of parliament. And the first contest was who between Kenneth Stanley Njino Matiba and Jaramogi Oginga Odinga should be opposition leader. Who solved the problem? Moi and Kanu. How did they do it? They started causing defections.
Yeah.
And the first defection was that of
there was the Momanyi guy who was
of DP. Momanyi was DP. DP had 29 members.
Then there was a Pili Wawire, there was Haniri.
It was actually three.
Shamala.
It was Japheth Shamala, Haniri, and Magwagwa. Yes. Three of them, Kanu caused their defection. So the advantage immediately went to Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who I believe Moi actually preferred in the opposition seat as opposed to Kenneth Stanley Njino Matiba. So Forder Silly suddenly became not the official
but you know what was interesting? I think even Moi, I mean the opposition claimed that Moi had rigged the 92 election, which may have happened, but in honesty, even without any rigging, Moi had a very nuanced understanding of politics in this country. He knew what each ethnic community felt about the next and that sort of thing. And he knew that if he would stitch something along the lines of his native ethnic community, the Kalenjin, and then the smaller communities that still held him in high esteem, then he was actually going to get 30-something percent.
Yep.
And he knew there was no single community elsewhere, whether it was the Luo, the Kikuyu, and whatever, that could get to that. And therefore he knew as long as they were divided, he was fine. And in a sense, if you look at what happened then thereafter, even the quest for a new constitution and that sort of thing, many of the things that were eventually put even in the constitution we have today were a direct response to Moi's tactics.
Yes.
So much so that many scholars say today that our constitution is too prescriptive, but it was because they were trying to guard against a situation where they would have to leave so much to the discretion of one person. 50+1 was a direct response to what happened in 92 and 97, because he was winning, but he was really a minority president.
Moi said Wakano would rule for 100 years.
Actually, Joe, even the process of handing over power is as a result of the Moi days. I mean, talk to politicians who are in the NAC team.
And a bit of the Kibaki 2007.
Yes. In fact, you remember some of the politicians who are in the 2002 NAC team were saying, even up to and including the day of transfer of power, they were still not sure Moi would do it. And that explains the hurried nature of that handing over ceremony, that even the military could not perform, and you could see some urgency, because probably they were thinking, even at that very field, that he was going to change his mind and say, Sipatiani ikitu.
Right.
Yeah, because he ruled with a very strong spirit. It was hovering all over the place. You can't trust it until you see it happening. It's very, very true that the last minute, there were those who didn't believe that he was going to leave. But the game changed when we saw Uhuru Kenyatta actually conceding at Serena Hotel, saying that the next president will be Mwai Kibaki. So I think he was distrusted because you never knew what he can pull from his
what you were saying about
many tricks that he had, and he had a lot of tricks. One of which, Joe, you correctly explained there, is that common touch. The way he beat the opposition in 1992 and 97 was all about playing the rural vote against the urban vote. The opposition was talking of high-minded things like corruption and GDP. Moi was saying itaongeza ugali kwa sufuria zetu. You know, talking the common man's language, and that's why he retained the rural vote. It's a tactic that works with African politics. Leave the urban centers where people are more problematic and they question a lot of things, and they are not even as many as the rural folk. So we'll go to where it counts, and that's what Moi did, and won the vote because of the rural vote.
In fact, they'll tell you nowadays, Kenya haiko Nairobi. Nairobi sio Kenya. Kenya ni kubwa kuliko Nairobi, so to say.
So I think, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to take this home. Robert, Nisa, final word.
Truncated version, an abridged version.
An abridged version.
Yeah.
So it's